Okay, good evening. Welcome to the Princeton Public Library. Thank you for joining us. I'll introduce myself in just one moment, but first I'd like to make an announcement about this space's accessibility. The community room is T-Coil enabled. If you have T-Coil enabled devices, please feel welcome to switch them on at this time. If you don't have a T-Coil enabled device but would like to use one of our headsets, we've made some available on the small table by the entrance. Tonight's program will be live streamed to YouTube, so I'll ask for anyone who wishes to speak at any point during the program, please wait to use a microphone before calling out into the room. I'll also request that you silence your cell phones for the duration of the program. My name is Cliff Robinson, and as the Public Humanities Specialist, I lead the library's Public Humanities Initiative, which was made possible in part with support from the National Endowment for the Humanities. Tonight's program was sponsored by the Criminal Justice Initiative at Princeton University's School of Public and International Affairs, which supplied free copies of the book to the first 50 people registered for this event, and it was co-sponsored by the Effron Center for the Study of America at Princeton University. On behalf of the library and everyone here, I'd like to thank our university partners for their support. And I'll just say briefly about the book collecting. We were doing some of it at the beginning. If you didn't get your copy yet and you were one of the first 50 people, it's okay, we'll continue after the program. If you were not one of the first 50 people, don't despair. There's a good chance you might still be able to get a book. There are a few people, and I stress a few people, have said, I won't be able to make it tonight, so just give my book to somebody else. So what I'll do, I think, if you weren't one of the first 50, enough people have expressed interest now that I think we have to sort of figure it out. So I'll ask you to leave me your name and email address, and we'll try to figure it out, okay? So we'll do that afterwards, though. All right, so getting to the program itself. It is my pleasure this evening to introduce Karida L. Brown, who is a professor of sociology at Emory University, an NAACP Image Award-winning author, and a public intellectual. Brown is a leading scholar of systemic racism and the study of Black life. Her work, which spans over a decade of groundbreaking research and analysis, has earned her both national and international acclaim. She is the author of the New Brownies book, A Love Letter to Black Families, continuing the legacy of W.E.B. Du Bois by centering Black narratives and empowering Black futures. Tonight, Karida presents her new book, The Battle for the Black Mind, published by Legacy Lit, an imprint of Hachette, earlier this year in May. Per the publisher, The Battle for the Black Mind is an explosive historical account of the struggle for educational justice in America. Drawing on over a decade of archival research, personal reflection, and keen sociological insight, this book traces a century of segregated schooling, examining how early efforts to control Black minds through education systems has laid the foundation for systemic inequities we still live with today. NAACP Image Award-winning author Karida L. Brown takes readers from the rural South to the bustling cities of the North and connects the dots between the experiences of Black students and educators across the nation. From the founding of early historically Black colleges and universities, such as Hampton, Atlanta, Tuskegee, to the rise of the Black freedom struggle, The Battle for the Black Mind weaves together the stories of pioneering Black leaders and the institutions they built to educate future generations. Kirkus Reviews explains that though the book shows how Black Americans fit or did not fit into institutions of instruction over the past 2 centuries, Brown also writes a personal history of coming to terms with what it means to be educated and Black in America, sounding a call for activism in response to governmental scaling back of diversity initiatives and the recognition of African American achievement. They call the book an uncompromising history of Black education in America. Meanwhile, Terry Schlickenmeyer, correspondent at the Philadelphia Tribune, adds the following: The Battle for the Black Mind is a lively book that you can read for information, history, or just because, but beware. It might make you want to get up, contact your representative or congressperson, and act. It's the kind of book that'll make you think. To discuss her new book, Karida is joined this evening by Laurence Ralph, professor of anthropology at Princeton University and previously at Harvard University. His research explores how police abuse, mass incarceration, and the drug trade make disease, disability, and premature death seem natural for urban residents of color who are often seen as disposable. His first book, Renegade Dreams, received the C. Wright Mills Award. His second book, The Torture Letters, explores a decade-long scandal in which hundreds of Black men were tortured in police custody. His writing has been featured in the Paris Review, the New York Times, the New York Review of Books, The Nation, the Chicago Review of Books, Boston Review, and Foreign Affairs. Tonight's program is the culminating event in our Public Humanities Author Series, which brings into focus a topic which the library's Public Humanities Initiative has been prioritizing through this year, namely justice. Throughout 2025, our programming has been exploring justice from multiple perspectives and through the intersecting textures of our dense social fabric. This thematic programming was launched in January with the panel discussion on history and restorative justice in Princeton. And a soon-to-be-announced closing event will occur on the evening of December 12th, so please mark your calendars for that. But for now, I'll hand it over to Laurence to begin tonight's discussion. First, let's thank them both for being here.
Thank you all for coming out and receiving this book and receiving the information that Karida has to share with you today. In the context that we're living through today, the book is ever more urgent, and it seems like even gathering in spaces like this in the context of book bans, in the context of censorship, of critical racial topics seems more urgent than ever. And so I want to commend you guys for coming out and gathering, because that's important, and that's part of the message of this book, I believe. But I wanted to begin by having Karida just share a few words in her voice from the book so that you guys can get a sense of how it's delivered and how the book is written, because I think the writing itself is a key intervention of this book.
Hey, y'all. Good evening, Princeton. Thank you so much for being with us this evening. I want to tell you a little bit about Mary. Mary is a woman who was born in 1823 in Virginia. This is during the period of slavery, but Mary is what was classified as a free Black woman of color. Okay, so unlike the majority of Black Americans, Mary was not enslaved. Mary was therefore able to attain an education. Her family sent her to DC, where she was able to go to school and graduate high school. Very quickly upon graduation, she moves back to Virginia and sets up a dress shop. That's her day job. But what is Mary doing in the evenings? She's sneaking onto plantations in her community, teaching Black folks how to read, write, and what she called cipher, because she knew that one day her people would be free, and this would be exactly the power that her folks would need to navigate. Ironically, it was the chaos of the Civil War that finally brought Mary's underground operation into the light. In 1861, the Confederate Army burned the city of Hampton to the ground in an attempt to prevent the Union Army from using it as a strategic base. Mary's family, along with so many others, sought refuge at the nearby Union camp at Fort Monroe. There, formerly enslaved refugees were deemed contraband of war, a title that protected them from recapture by their so-called owners. After 2 decades of defying Virginia's racist laws that tried to keep her people in the dark, Mary officially established her school in the light of day at Fort Monroe, teaching Black fugitives who had sought asylum with Lincoln's army. On September 17th, 1861, Mary gathered a dozen students, including her own 5-year-old daughter, Daisy, under the shade of a majestic oak tree for the first day of school. Her class quadrupled in size within a week's time. Mary tirelessly delivered her lessons to Black minds who lay in wait at the precipice of freedom. As the country tore itself apart in a bloody civil war, her students gorged themselves on the fruit of knowledge she provided under the shade of that oak tree. Word of Mary's school soon reached the AMA, a New England faith-based abolitionist organization. It sent provisions to Fort Monroe, arranged a small salary for Mary, and purchased Brown Cottage, a modest home on the property where she could continue to teach. With its support, Mary Smith Peake became the first Black teacher of record for a Freedmen's Bureau school. Despite a persistent cough that worsened daily, Mary continued to teach. The fresh air brought in by the river wind didn't comfort her lungs much, but the simple beauty of the shaded lawn pleased her nonetheless. When she could no longer walk to her oak tree, she taught from her bed in Brown Cottage as her students sat along the floor by her bedside, hanging on to her every word. In 1863, just 1 year after her death, the local community gathered under Mary's tree to hear President Abraham Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation, the very first reading of that address in the American South. Today, that tree, Emancipation Oak, stands as a National Historic Landmark on the campus of Hampton University. Hampton blossomed under that freedom tree.
That was beautiful.
Thank you. I love being able to share the stories of these Black women teachers who gave so much so that we could have.
Right, right. And I want to come back to that. I mean, you described this book as both a history and a playbook for freedom, right? We're going to come back to the history part, but I want to get to the playbook part, right?
Yeah.
Because I'm reading from the Department of Education, Office for Civil Rights, memo, February 2025, says treating students differently on the basis of race to achieve nebulous goals such as diversity, racial balancing, social justice, or equity is illegal under controlling Supreme Court precedent. Programs may appear neutral on their face, but a closer look reveals that they are in fact motivated by racial considerations, right? So what is this current playbook that is being used, and what are its roots? Like,
So first I want to comment on that language that's on that federal website. When we're talking about DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion, it's important to unpack what the argument is. What is the opposite of that? Homogeny, inequity, and exclusion. That is the most un-American thing I can imagine, right? And if those are the values that we're building our institutions upon, America, you in danger, girl, okay? But we've seen this before, right? This is not the first time that the United States has experienced an era of American fascism, of oppressive authoritarian rule. However, our past example of this was a time that was reserved, this treatment was reserved just for a small swath of the population, for Black Americans, for Native Americans, for people of color living in these United States. That was the Jim Crow era. That's exactly what that was. So we have an example, a working example in this country of what it looks like for the US government to abandon its students, to abandon its youth through the education system, whether that's through withholding or revoking monies, whether that is through rolling out separate and unequal curricula, resources, space, training, towards different aims for different peoples. We've experienced that. This wasn't that long ago either. My mother and father, Richard and Arnita Brown, attended what were called colored schools in Lynch, Kentucky, okay? That was a Jim Crow state. That was the law of the land. They were also a part of that generation that were America's foot soldiers perfecting this country's democracy by doing what? Desegregating those schools as young people. Our kids did that. So when I was writing this book, you're absolutely right. I wasn't just wanting to write a history of Black education. I wanted this to be a playbook because there are recipes in this book, y'all. There are strategies for how African Americans took their education into their own hands, created their own curricula, built their own schools, wanting the government to do right by them as citizens who were paying into a tax system that were excluding them. They wanted the full rights of citizenship, but until such time as if the government wasn't going to do it, they were going to do it and make sure that their kids were going to be good. So I take the time to tell those stories of how they did it and also how they then shared power, networks, and resources to make sure that those systems could be replicated across Black communities. And this is how, over the course of 3 generations, they brought Jim Crow to its knees. They did wrench that full citizenship. They wrenched that freedom, and education has always been a cornerstone of the long Black freedom struggle. Today, we all can learn some of those recipes and apply them. Why? Because today, those exclusionary practices, those oppressive practices are available to all of us. And the question is, are we a democracy or aren't we? Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Yeah. So I think that was a wonderful answer because it gives us some of the kind of strategies of resilience for overcoming this time, and also some of the ways that kind of fugitivity has been critical and might have to be critical in this moment. Yeah. But I feel like there's also a playbook from the other side that you're describing, which has to do with the way that power congeals.
Yeah.
And that, I also see the echoes in the present day, and I want you to elaborate about that, particularly around this convergence between education, big money, philanthropy, and the idea of the Black student. Right.
Yeah. I take a lot of time throughout the book to give, this is really a history of how power moves. Mm-hmm. So, we understand the term systemic racism, right? But I wanted to be able to, through the stories of what everyday people were doing, to illustrate how the system works, how it was designed, and also the many, many roles that so many people play to either uphold systems of power or to dismantle them and redistribute that power. When we're talking about philanthropy's role in the history of Black education, do you know that the very first big philanthropies that we've had in the United States of America were all established to build and control the school system in the South right after the Civil War? All of these philanthropies, including your Rockefellers and Carnegie corporations, and also smaller foundations like the Slater Fund, the Anson Phelps Stokes Fund, they all had specific divisions solely focused on Black education. What did those philanthropies want to do? They created these grant-making policies that came with thick strings attached. Okay, Black school in this rural community, your public board of education is giving your school pennies on the dollar. You can't function to have a school in your community. We will fund you with private dollars, but you must deliver an adapted curricula that we've designed for Black Americans. What is that curricula? It is the industrial model of education that's basically designed to teach Black people how to do, not think. Okay? An industrial education curricula that's designed to, and I'll quote, to train Black Americans for their rightful place in American society, to train the next generation of domestic servants and farmers. Now, I want you to ask yourself this question. After at least 250 years of slavery, do you think that Black people needed more training in domestic service? And do you get where we're going here? And why would big philanthropy, which are mainly northern entities, care so much about Black education? I found through my 8 years of archival research, they cared a lot. They left a lot of records, so I didn't have to guess. Philanthropy is often a proxy of wealthy people, wealthy individuals, right? The entity serves as an interface to do the will of an individual. Well, if you have your generation of industrial robber barons, okay, who own the railroad companies, who own the oil fields, who own the coal mines, what do they need? An endless supply of cheap labor that is not going to be demanding union rights, equal pay, better working conditions. So they very much understood the way to capture an entire generation of future manual workers. You don't get them through the whip. You get them through their mind. Just one generation of a diluted curricula, a diluted education would offer them a depoliticized Black population to come in and do those kinds of jobs. So it's important, I thought, in the book to tell those dual stories of power. Black power building within community through education, and also the power of philanthropy, big money, folks who might have different dreams in mind for you vis-a-vis their own children, okay? My aunties, when I was growing up, they had this saying, all money ain't good money, and that's what I demonstrate throughout the book.
Right, and I love the way that you demonstrated through the battles, right? So this is actually literal battles for the Black mind, and the characters become really pivotal in these battles. And of course, you have the iconic battle between Du Bois and Washington, but there are also other battles that, I didn't know about and I learned a lot about, and particularly around the history of the HBCUs and who is founding these HBCUs and when, and the difference between some of the white male founders, Black women founders. Can you talk a little bit about the idea of battle around some of those figures who become really important in the text?
Yeah. I'll preface this by stating a recognition that HBCUs are all of our heirloom in this country. They are such important and vital institutions that continue to be an engine for especially producing the Black professional class, right? So I have great honor and respect for HBCUs. And also, I had to tell the truth about the history of the founding, the origin story of many of our HBCUs, most of which were not founded by African Americans, most of which were established with a certain set of aims in mind that did not necessarily align with the values or freedom dreams of the Black folks who would be attending those schools. So I tell the story, and I focus in the book on the story of, if we want to call them characters, two main HBCUs, Hampton and Tuskegee. They're like sister institutions that followed this model in its early days of rolling out this industrial model of education. And Atlanta University, which is today Clark Atlanta University, which followed a liberal arts education model. Both institutions founded by white men, first led by white men, but with totally different aims. So I just kind of take folks down those two paths to show how the battle unfolded around this idea of not only whether Black Americans should even have education, but if they were to have it, what kind and on whose terms. And this is where the battle really played out, and it was ideological. This idea of who are Black people in freedom in this country. Are they citizens or are they subjects? And that's expressed through the school.
Yeah, wonderful. And let me zoom out a little bit and ask you about this relationship between freedom and democracy. Because I think, you're dealing with 100-year histories and the way that you're deep in the archive. I think from the discussion, one could get the sense that you wrote the book to the moment, right? But reading the book and being someone who writes books, I know that you couldn't have started this book in this moment, right?
I looked way different when I started researching this book.
So this had to be years and years and years and years and years and years and years of work, right? And you couldn't have known what was going to be at the end of that. We all didn't know what was going to be at the end of that. And it could have been a very different reality at the end of it than it is now, right? And so how do you think about that, the work, like the guiding principles that sustained you in the archive and thinking about what does democracy mean in relationship to this history? And what are you trying to say about democracy and the long durée of democracy that would be relevant whether or not Kamala Harris or Donald Trump is in the Oval Office, but just so happens to speak in a particular way to this historical moment, right?
That's such a beautiful question. As a scholar of the African American experience, I know that the long freedom struggle is just that. It never ends. So there is always a reason, an urgency, and a now for writing about Black people, places, and things in this country, right? That is always going to be evergreen. So whether the book came out 5 years ago or now, there would be a relevance and a salient. So I wasn't so much concerned with the moment, while I was absolutely floored, like many of us. The book came out in May. This is the same month that the present administration announces that they are actively dismantling the Department of Education. It is also on the 71st anniversary of Brown versus Board of Education. So there was certainly the timing, I think, was apt for the book, but I think it would have been just as apt had it come out, 2 administrations ago. Why? Because a community elder of mine, Dr. Jessica B. Harris. She has this beautiful saying, the relay must be assured. And she says that when she's looking at the next generation. The relay must be assured. What that means to me is that whatever our struggle is in our generation, it's our job to carry that baton. But we don't put that baton down. It's your kids who are going to pick that up. They might have a different set of freedom dreams that they're aiming towards, but nonetheless, the struggle continues for freedom and liberation for Black people. And if Black people are free, everybody is free, right? So that, to me, motivates the urgency with which I write my work, and also the time that I can take to let it cook, because I know it's going to be relevant no matter when. It's going to come out when it's supposed to come out.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Along the lines of what you just said, you opened the book with a proverb, a Jamaican proverb about small acts, right?
Yeah.
Can you explain to the audience?
Yes. So there is a Jamaican saying, small axe fall big tree. Bob Marley has a song about that I opened the book up with. Small axe fall big tree. That was the lesson that I ultimately learned at the end of writing this book. And I'm sure you experienced this, Laurence. Like, we learn from our own books, right? And the takeaway for me after writing the stories about Black educators who not only taught a generation of Black children, but also founded their own schools that lasted for at least 50 years. And I was just ever impressed with how did they do that? And that was the lesson. Small axe fall big tree. It is rarely the, one big action, the one fell swoop that brings about the change that we want to see. It is the 1,001 little things that we do every day within your own sphere of influence, with your own resources, within the own power that you have within yourself, just showing up day after day, chopping at that tree. Small axe, fall big tree. That is how African Americans not only built these educational institutions that I talk about, this is also how many Black organizations come to be founded through Black schools, like our Divine Nine and other institutions like the National Association of Colored Women, We Lift as We Climb. These are small acts, falling big tree. This is also the strategy that brought the big tree of Jim Crow down. It was the 1,001 small acts. Yeah.
Well, I want to open it up for the audience discussion, but I just have one last question. I think one thing that was remarkable about this book for me is just the relationship that you describe between the mind, the body, and labor, right? Mm-hmm. So I feel like the book could be called The Battle for the Black Body. It could be called The Battle for Black Labor. And it could be the same book, right? And it's as much about who gets educated and why as it is about who doesn't get educated. And I say that as a way of asking you, who is Charles Stinney Jr.?
Ooh.
And can you talk about him to the audience?
Does anybody recognize this little boy on the cover of the book? So this is a painting of a young man named George Stinney Jr. He was and remains the youngest American citizen to ever be executed by the state. So he's born and raised in South Carolina, and in 1944, he is convicted of killing 2 white girls in his community. This is a crime that George Stinney Jr. did not commit. He is, but quickly convicted, tried, found guilty, and sentenced to death by electric chair. They did electrocute George Stinney Jr. His body was, the little 14-year-old body, too little to fit in the electric chair, so they had to stack up phone books so that he could be tall enough for the state to cook him, and they made his parents come and watch. Okay? My husband is an artist, a fine artist named Charlie Palmer. He has committed to painting of George, one painting of George at least every year, so that we always remember George. This painting on the cover of the book is my way of participating in that commitment. This series, you can see, has these stars here that makes you think of the American flag, and it just symbolizes how the system has and continues to fail Black youth. But it's also a way for us to remember George as a little boy who was beautiful, who also had dreams, whose family loved him. So it's a way also just to love on this little boy who didn't get the chance to actualize his freedom dreams. So thank you for giving me the opportunity to talk about him.
All right, so we'll open it up to the audience for questions.
Somebody's coming.
I think that in the current political climate, it can feel like the small things we do don't really matter, and small acts fall big trees, the most encouraging thing I've heard in quite a while. So I just want to say thank you.
Oh, wow.
Thank you for that.
Yeah, you're welcome. I thank them. I think the amazing educators in this book who taught me that. And something that I'll say about this moment, in that feeling of overwhelm, okay? May I give you all a playbook? Because the playbook that is at play right now today is the same old raggedy, tired playbook that was used back then. And I love exposing it. It's only 3 steps to this playbook. Number 1, it is to defund. Defund institutions and systems that give us some sense of a safety net, right? And defund does not mean eradicate. It means defund to bring our institutions down to the bare bones where nothing quite works, right? Where the system is raggedy, where it's not delivering the care and safety that it should. Step 1. Step 2, what does that defunding do? It manufactures chaos. So that feeling of overwhelm, of exhaustion, of confusion is intentional. It's intended to make you feel like your small acts can't fall this big tree. That's a Jedi mind trick. Step 3, once you've destabilized through defunding, you've created and manufactured chaos, folks are just looking for anybody to come with an answer. Can somebody come and make this stop? And that's when step 3 happens. The billionaires swoop in and say, I got the answer. Let me privatize that for you. That's the playbook. That is the playbook, but it relies on you believing an untruth, which is that we don't have the power. And what I learned from these women in this book, that it is power to the people, not power to the people in power. Small acts fall big tree.
Okay, hello, hi.
Hi.
So when I came to this, I didn't expect this to be as relevant to what I'm literally reading from my history of African American education.
Anderson.
I'm reading
yes.
Anderson right now, and I guess it's kind of a question, also a comment. And I could also like get the answer to this question once I read the book, but this is not an easy book to read, I will say. I mean, this is like so much relevant information, but this is a very dry book. This is very hard. I'm just wondering, I mean, you've read Anderson,
Yes.
I understand. So do you see your book as like a revitalization of that information and more of like a popular like nonfiction context? Because this is very much like an academic book. Or does your history go further to the present?
Okay, first of all, no one has ever whooped out a copy of The Black Education in the South by the Dr. James Anderson. His work is seminal in the history of Black education. That book is foundational to my scholarship, and I am because of him and that work. So yes, the battle for the Black mind tells a popular version of this history. I do go in a few different directions with really centering the stories of these Black women school founders and educators. So that's a contribution or extension of the work. But I intentionally, Battle for the Black Mind, it's my 6th book, but my very first trade book. And this was a very intentional decision that I made to want to write a trade book. Academic books, we get to be dry. We get to be pedantic. I don't have to care about how you're going to experience the book. And there's a certain freedom in that kind of writing, especially when you're nerding out like me and Laurence like to do, right? But I felt a responsibility to regular, degular, smegular people, like my nieces, who are now thinking about where they're going to apply to college, like my students who are trying to understand and navigate this landscape, like my aunties and cousins and, just people who are not in academia. So I chose the trade book route so that I could, get this story out to the masses. And that requires a totally different kind of writing. So when you experience the battle for the Black mind, where I might be wanting to explain to you racial capitalism. Do you think that I ever say racial capitalism in the book? No, I'm going to tell you a story about what everyday people were doing back in those days. I'm going to bring you into the minds and motivations and hearts of the characters in the book. So it's a storied book that's really driven by, what people did. And I hope that the reader walks away with a deeper understanding of some of these concepts that I'm sneaking into the book through the stories, but no, it's intentionally made to be for a public audience.
Thank you. I just think that's so great because I was reading this, I'm like, everyone needs to know about this. I know everyone's not going to read this book to get there. And I also just want to say I love the inclusion of the women behind these, this history, because learning a lot about Booker T and learning a lot about Armstrong, a lot about the men who were making the decision, not the women who were actually making it happen. Yeah. So thank you.
As I say in the book, because I have a whole chapter on Booker T. Washington and W.E.B. Du Bois, where I say that their beef was the original diss tape. So before there was Drake and Kendrick, don't I write it just like that in the book? Before it was Drake and Kendrick, before there was, Jay-Z and Nas or Biggie and Tupac, it was W.E.B. Du Bois and Booker T. Washington. This is the first time you have Black titans who have public platforms put all their business out on the street and start, coming at each other's necks, okay? What does the diss tape do as a genre? It actually is a political genre. It opens up the space for everybody, everyday people, to engage in a discourse around a set of issues. That's what that was, because with that beef, you had African Americans from all walks of life now discussing the aims of Black education. That's what the beef was originally about. But after I give you that chapter, I immediately get to the women, because I say, while it was the men who had the microphones and the platforms, it was Black women who were rolling up their sleeves, doing the work, building the buildings and making sure that Black youth got what they needed, not just in an unforeseen future, but right now in their communities. And those were stories that Mary Smith Peak, I hadn't heard of her before. I didn't know about Charlotte Hawkins Brown. I had heard about Mary McLeod Bethune, but I didn't know all that she did to build her institution. So being able to not only write these women's stories, rightfully so, back into the historical record, but to also take the time to make you feel them. I want you to imagine what they look like and to feel the tone of their voice and how they moved, how they made their students feel. And that part is, to me, an act of spiritual reparations.
Hi there. First of all, I want to say thank you because I come from Hampton Roads, Virginia, actually. So it's like I was equally surprised to hear about this today and to hear you speak about Mary Smith Peak specifically because I also read that book a couple years ago for my research. But I wanted to ask, in doing that research, I learned a little bit about just, in that context that she was in and that folks were in general, some of the difficulties of educating, given, what Laurence was talking about with the opposite playbook, trying to control your education. If you had learned anything about just maybe the more subtle ways to educate, and if you could speak on that. So for example, in the church, I learned how important that was for kind of establishing education systems, both institutionally, but like you mentioned just then, spiritually as well. So, yeah.
It is, I think, useful for us to think about education and schooling in the most capacious terms. And if we can think of it both including but outside of what that formal institution, what the Princeton of it all looks like, you will see that, education and those spaces are articulating themselves all over the place. And that when we look at the tradition and the history of Black education, you mentioned churches. While the Freedmen's Bureau put in $5 million between 1865 and 1870, so in a 5-year period, $5 million back then is about $145 million in today's days. With that money, they were able to build 5,000 rural schools throughout the South. That was a major intervention. What's less talked about, though, is African Americans with their nickels and dimes put their monies together and built 2,000 schools throughout the South during that same period. And where were those schools popping up? In churches, in basements, under a freedom tree, under an oak tree, getting in where you fit in, okay? And that is how the institutional field built itself out. And oftentimes it was folks who didn't have very much education themselves, taking whatever it is that they had and giving it back to the community. So being able to have a disposition where folks could learn from anybody, right? That there's a learning opportunity available in most interactions, and folks really did bring what they had to the space to cultivate and build educational power with the resources that they had available to them. Can you imagine if, and we can go back to the post-Reconstruction days, if Black communities waited for, oh, we need somebody with a PhD, then we can learn from them. What college did they go? Then we can learn from. No, they small acts fall big trees. That was another way they put that in practice. Until such time, until we get there, we're gonna make do with what we have and lift as we climb. And that was the mantra. I think that that's instructive for today. I think a lot about that as an educator myself, not only And this goes to your point, my sister who brought up the Anderson book. I have to challenge myself to think about, how do this generation of young folks that I'm teaching, how do they consume information? And am I adapting enough to be able to get them what they need and to reach them and to be able to engage them in that co-creation process of building knowledge? And it's made me have to change a bit about, how I show up in the classroom, but also what I deem as a learning opportunity. And it's not always going to be just through a book or an article, and it's not always going to be in the classroom. I've now personally started making my students get up. We're going out to Atlanta. We're going to go to a conference. We're going to go to Meals on Wheels and learn about hunger. We're going to go to our communities and use our city as a classroom, but also with a for what? Not just to look at problems, but how can we be using all that we're getting through these fancy educational spaces to actually do something with that, to make this world a little better than how you found it. I didn't make that up. Again, I learned that from our ancestors. Okay, so again, playbook.
Hi, mine is more of just a comment. I'm a marriage and family therapist, and I deal with a lot of clients and couples that are struggling right now and feeling invisible in the world. And as we process through some of these concepts in my room, I talk about narrative therapy, where change happens when through the words that we use. And just thinking about this book and how powerful it can be to just change the narrative, change their words, change the concepts of understanding that impact versus intent. And I really just had a very visceral response to just being here. And I just wanted to say thank you so much for writing, and I can't wait to read it and sharing these things with my clients and as a researcher in future work. So just thank you so much.
Thank you.
Of course.
Mm. Mm. Mm.
Thank you so much for a really beautiful talk. And I wanted to ask you about what types of big trees you see that need to be felled. So we've talked about the state, we've talked about a certain kind of philanthropy. And I was wondering if in your book, the role of very elite institutions like Princeton, like Yale, have come up in terms of how they are also big trees that need to be felled as we try to think through and free the minds of the ways in which people of color are engaged through the educational project in America. And I say this as someone who resigned from the Princeton writing program this January because I experienced a kind of just deeply embedded white supremacy within that program, and it's something that affects every student who attends Princeton. So I wondered if the kind of big tree of the elite university and the kinds of racialized elite education that run through them are addressed in your book, and how we fell that big tree, particularly in age of Trump, where you're kind of caught between, destroying DEI, but also seeing how damaging and destructive DEI within these institutions also is.
The big tree of access. And what I mean by that is, while we work, live, take up space in these elite institutions, it is our choice with what we then do with the knowledge and the resources and what we're getting in these spaces. So it's a choice to only produce other academic works that's only speaking to other academics. It's a choice to only publish your work in venues that might get you accolades amongst your colleagues, but all sits behind a paywall. It's a choice to only show up for, and I mean, I heard an academic say this once, I don't get out of bed for a gig that's not at least gonna pay my mortgage for the month. That's a choice, and that's a mindset. I'm naming that because I'm naming choices that are independent of the elite institution. It's how you then, Moten and Harney say, the undercommons of what they call that book? Was it just called The Undercommons?
Yeah.
The undercommon. How you then use the institution and invert it to get back to community. It's choices on how we leverage that thing. That's one big tree that could be felled with no permission. You don't need permission from the institution to do that. Showing up in your local community. Go talk to the kids in the where's the closest high school or junior high school to where you live? And go reach out to the principal, to the administrators, do a workshop. Go talk to the kids about something. Like, there are choices that we all could be making for how our small axes are showing up. Another big tree is this, you bring up the white supremacy of it all in the space. So oftentimes when Black and brown folks get into these institutions, they are extremely hostile spaces, ones that either require complete denial of your own self through a forced assimilation that could never happen, that is not possible, which makes folks want to either disappear themselves or exclude themselves from the institution, what have you. And so that is another big tree. One thing that, is a battle that I've been a part of with a whole motley crew of other brilliant scholars, sociologists, it's decolonizing that curricula. It is insisting, and that's not just in my classroom, it's holding my colleagues accountable. What is the curricula that we're delivering in our department or in our schools and this and that, and holding our institutions accountable for how whiteness is showing up in our teaching practices, our instruments, our curricula, our language. If you notice, just here with y'all, I earned my PhD from Brown University, okay? I am an expert in what I'm talking about. I'm credentialed, and yet I grew up in a working class family that doesn't speak the King's English. So a small act that I do is when I do public speaking, I'm gonna say, hey, y'all. Because that's the way I talk when I'm with my family. And I might use a couple slang words. Why? Because I grew up in New York and I'm an old millennial. And showing up as myself in spaces, you would be surprised how many students have come to me and said how liberating that is. Because if they see me doing it and I somehow can belong, I somehow hold whatever little power I hold in this space, I, too, can be what's called an academic, a scholar, then it's okay for them to be themselves, too. They can then take their mask off a little bit, too, and they might think that they could be okay. They might think that they don't have to feel invisible or make themselves invisible in order to just exist in these spaces. So sometimes it's the big thing that we got to do that might come with risk. And you might lose something for certain small acts that you make. Other ones are so small they might seem like they don't make a difference, but you have no idea how you're just giving somebody the life that they need to be able to know that they can do it too. It's the small acts, y'all.
Do we have time for one more question? I saw a hand up front.
I just wanted to ask about, I know that the title is the Battle for the Black Mind, and I was so inspired about listening to you talk about Black women who oftentimes are not centered. I'm at the seminary and am a dual degree master's student with a 2-year-old baby, so we doing it. Uh, and I just wanted to ask you, because I'm just so curious, even at the seminary, because I'm a womanist theologian, right? So that's just, Black women telling their stories and honoring their own spirituality. And so I'm just so curious as to how we protect our these just informal means of producing knowledge and sharing knowledge, because I know I have the whiteness is still very much embedded in the fabric of the curriculum, and I've had several informal conversations. I learn a lot through my other classmates, because a lot of the times when I ask for specific resources from professors who are experts in their field, they tell me that the people that I am searching for don't exist. But if I were to ask that same question to a PhD student, he, would give me an abundance of resources. So I just ask, and then even I may be able to just find those things myself. Like I've had several moments where I felt like I wasn't fed by the academy and I had to go off and do my own separate research projects. But the question really is I'm aware that there is a battle for the Black mind, but I'm curious as to how we protect our means of producing knowledge and keep these spaces, whether they're in institutions or otherwise, how do we keep them sacred?
So I've used the term freedom dreams a lot this evening. That's derived from the Robin D.G. Kelley, brilliant historian, Black scholar who wrote the book Freedom Dreams. This is not an amorphous concept that just lives in the abstract. It is, in fact, the driver and motivating factor of what is called the Black radical tradition. This is a tradition of activism, community organizing, and intellectualism that it's a tradition that we can trace back to the second that African people were captured, enslaved, and put on that boat. And you can trace it through African American history. Why do I bring up all of that pretext? That's where the recipes are. At the root of the Black radical tradition, it requires a radical political imagination, meaning that you dream of a world and show up as though the world that you dream for already exists. That's that Mary Smith peak. Why would you be sneaking onto plantations to teach enslaved folks how to read? What do they need to read for? Her radical political imagination saw something else, so she acted as though it were already true. That's number one. The Black radical tradition, of which all of these women followed, of which you are a part of that tradition, as am I, is rooted in love. That's the basis. It's rooted in love and community and finding your people. So sometimes you're gonna demand to get what's due to you, what you are entitled to as a student and a citizen of this institution. There are certain things that your program owes you, and you have every right to make sure that you get those things. Other times, it is about not placing your freedom dreams and the destination of your liberation, your work, your scholarship, your genius, not placing that in the hands of the institution. Do you see how that shifts the power? Okay? And that then allows you, Black genius, to find your people, find your community, your interlocutors, those scholars, other students, professors, and folk out in the streets who are going to value your work, engage it, make sure that you get what you need, pass on the resources, make sure that you're being advocated for in rooms that you're not even in. That, unfortunately, is the situation, the lived reality for every Black academic. I'll tell you, when I was in grad school, I had my formal dissertation committee, and I had what I call my shadow dissertation committee. Okay? I got a PhD in the sociology department. I secretly also, in my mind, got a PhD from Africana Studies because I was taking all their classes too. And those professors loved me. Okay? They had high standards for me, but I found people who loved me and they trained me. And I was obedient to that process also. So it's double work. I wish it wasn't that way, but that's a part of that process. And follow the Black radical tradition. You will find your way, your people, and what you need.
Wow, I can think of no better place to end. Amazing. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you both
so
for being
much.
here. All right.
Thank
Everyone
you,
have a good night.
Laurence.